The champagne was vintage, the smiles were practiced, and the betrayal was absolute. It was supposed to be the perfect night my parents' golden anniversary merged with my brother Kevin's engagement party. As usual, I was on the sidelines, the invisible daughter holding the glue together, while Kevin took the credit. Then Aunt Anna, whose memory was fading, but whose timing was lethal, dropped the bomb. In a room full of Manhattan's elite, she pointed a shaking finger at my mother's neck. "Margaret, why are you wearing those pearls? Didn't Mom leave those in the lake house to Samantha in her will, back in '98? The silence that followed was louder than any scream. My mother, a woman who could lie to a priest without blinking, went sheet white. She looked at me, eyes begging for me to smooth it over to be the reliable one again. But for the first time in my life, I didn't step in. I just took a slow, deliberate sip of my wine and smiled. Because right then, I realized the truth: they hadn't been protecting me. They had been robbing me for 28 years. They thought that $1.5 million house was their personal piggy bank. They had no idea I was about to turn it into a prison. Stick around, because you're about to witness exactly how I used their own greed to legally lock away their fortune forever. This isn't just revenge, it's a masterclass in justice. My name is Samantha Sterling, and at 46 years old, I am a professional problem solver. By day, I work as an operations director for a mid-sized logistics firm in Chicago, a job that requires me to be invisible, efficient, and relentlessly reliable. It is a role I was born into, practiced within the walls of my childhood home long before I ever earned a paycheck. I am the daughter who remembers the birthdays, the sister who co-signs the loans, and the woman who stays sober at weddings to ensure the vendors get paid. I have spent my entire life believing that being useful was the same thing as being loved, but tonight, under the crystal chandeliers of the Pierre Hotel, that belief was about to shatter. The occasion was my parents' golden wedding anniversary, a celebration that felt less like a party and more like a theatrical production. The air in the ballroom was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the murmur of polite envy. While the guests sipped champagne and admired the ice sculpture, I was in the corner, quietly arguing with the catering manager about the shortage of crab cakes. My mother, Margaret, sat at the head table, looking regal in a gold sequined gown, her hand resting possessively on my father's arm. My brother Kevin was standing to make the toast. At 43, Kevin still possessed the boyish charm of a high school quarterback who never quite grew up. He raised his glass, flashing that dazzling, reckless smile that had gotten him out of every speeding ticket and bad investment he'd ever made. He spoke of our parents' enduring love and sacrifice, reciting the heartfelt words I had written for him just 2 hours earlier because he had forgotten to prepare anything. The room swooned. My mother dabbed a tear from her eye, beaming at her golden boy. I stood in the shadows near the kitchen doors, checking my watch and smoothing the wrinkles in my sensible navy dress, invisible as always. Dinner was served, and the room settled into the rhythmic clinking of silver against china. I finally took my seat at the family table, positioned between a deaf uncle and my Aunt Anna. Anna was my mother's older sister, a woman who had once been sharp as a tack, but was now drifting through the early stages of dementia. Her mind was like an old radio, tuning in and out of static, but occasionally the signal came through with terrifying clarity. She was staring intently at my mother's neck, her brow furrowed in confusion. The table was quiet for a moment, the lull in conversation that happens when people are focused on their food. "Margaret," Aunt Anna said, her voice surprisingly loud in the hushed room, "why are you wearing those pearls?" My mother froze a forkful of salmon halfway to her mouth. She offered a tight, condescending smile. "They go with the dress, Anna. You know that." "No, I don't mean that," Anna insisted, pointing a trembling finger. "I mean, why do you have them?" "Didn't Mom leave those pearls to Samantha? I remember reading the will, the 1998 will. She left the pearls in the lake house to Samantha. She said you and Robert had enough and she wanted Samantha to have security. I thought Samantha owned it all." The silence that followed was absolute. It wasn't just a pause, it was a vacuum. The fork slipped from my mother's fingers, and hit her remote plate with a violence that sounded like a gunshot. For a second, the mask slipped. I saw genuine panic in her eyes, a flash of fear so raw it made my stomach turn. But Margaret Sterling was a master of recovery. She let out a breathless, pitying laugh, reaching over to pat Anna's hand. "Oh, poor Anna," she said loud enough for the table to hear. "You're confused again, dear. That was just a draft. We handled all of that years ago. You know how memory plays tricks." The guests at the table nodded sympathetically, returning to their meals relieved to bypass the awkwardness. But I didn't return to my meal. The year stuck in my mind like a splinter. 1998. I felt a cold sweat prickle at the back of my neck. I excused myself, my legs feeling like lead, and walked calmly toward the ladies' room. I locked the door of the furthest stall and leaned against the cold marble, trying to breathe. I wasn't reacting to Anna's confusion. I was reacting to the sudden, violent clarity of a memory I hadn't touched in decades. 1998. I was 18 years old, a naive freshman just weeks away from starting college. I remembered sitting at the kitchen table, the smell of my mother's lavender perfume suffocating me as she placed a stack of legal documents in front of me. She had smiled, that warm, reassuring smile she reserved for when she needed something. "Just standard paperwork, Sammy," she had said, flipping the pages so fast I couldn't read the headers. "Financial aid forms for tuition, some administrative updates for the family estate. We just need to get this filed so we can pay your dorm fees." I remembered the pen in my hand. I remembered the feeling of gratitude that my parents were taking care of the boring details so I could focus on my studies. I had signed my name over and over again, blindly trusting the people who were supposed to protect me. In the silence of that bathroom, the pieces clicked together with a sickening finality. The financial aid forms, the administrative updates, the lake house that I currently paid the mortgage on, but had bought from them years later. Aunt Anna wasn't confused. I was the one who had been confused. I looked at myself in the vanity mirror, seeing the lines of worry etched around my eyes, worry born from years of carrying this family's burdens. I realized then that the house, the pearls, the struggle to keep Kevin afloat, it wasn't duty, it was theft. I always thought I was the one who owed them for my upbringing. Standing in that bathroom, I realized they had been spending my inheritance to pay for it. The morning after the anniversary, the hangover I nursed wasn't from the champagne. It was from the gnawing, sickening realization that my entire life was a balancing act performed on a trap door. I sat at my kitchen table in my modest two-bedroom apartment, staring at the bank notification on my phone. The mortgage payment for the lake house had just cleared, draining nearly 40% of my monthly take-home pay. For years, I had told myself this was a noble sacrifice. 5 years ago, my parents had claimed they needed liquidity for their retirement. So I had stepped up. I took out a massive loan, bought the family estate from them for $1.5 million, and shouldered the debt. I didn't move in, of course. That privilege went to Kevin. He needed a creative space for his entrepreneurial ventures, which was code for living rent-free in a waterfront mansion, while I clipped coupons to pay the electric bill. I was the owner on paper, but in practice, I was nothing more than the landlord who paid for the tenant's lifestyle. The house wasn't an asset building my wealth. It was a parasite feeding on my future. The doorbell rang just as I was spiraling into a calculation of how much interest I had paid over the last 60 months. It was Kevin. He didn't look like the golden boy from the night before. His eyes were bloodshot, his designer shirt was wrinkled, and he reeked of stale scotch and desperation. He didn't ask how I was, he simply marched past me, pacing my small living room like a caged animal. He bypassed the pleasantries and dropped the bomb that would obliterate whatever fragile peace remained in our family. He was in deeper than the usual credit card max-outs or the failed crypto schemes. This time, he owed private lenders, the kind who didn't send letters, a staggering $800,000. The color drained from my face as he explained the solution he and Mother had already cooked up without me. They didn't want a loan from my savings. They knew I didn't have that kind of cash. They wanted the equity. Since the market had surged, the lake house was now worth significantly more than what I owed. They wanted me to execute a cash-out refinance, to take out a new, larger mortgage based on the home's current value, pay off the old one, and hand him the surplus cash. It sounded so simple when he said it, as if he were asking to borrow a cup of sugar. But I knew the math. Pulling out $800,000 meant resetting my mortgage clock. It meant doubling my monthly payments. It meant I would be shackled to that debt until I was 76 years old. When I tried to explain this, telling him that this would destroy my credit and my ability to ever retire, he just waved a hand dismissively, telling me I was being dramatic and that he'd pay me back when the next deal hits. He left when I refused to commit immediately, but the silence he left behind was short-lived. 10 minutes later, my phone rang. It was Mother. She didn't scream. That wasn't her way. Her voice was soft, laced with that distinct, disappointing tone that had controlled me since childhood. She didn't ask about the legality or the financial ruin this would cause me. Instead, she weaponized our history. She talked about how they had paid for my braces, my piano lessons, my safe suburban childhood. She framed the refinancing not as a financial transaction, but as a test of my character. "We protected you when you were young, Samantha." She purred, the sweetness masking the venom. "Now it is your turn to protect Kevin. He is fragile right now. He needs a win. It's just a signature, darling. Don't be selfish. We trust you to do the right thing." For decades, that word selfish had been the invisible whip that kept me in line. But as I sat there gripping the phone until my knuckles turned white, the memory of Aunt Anna's words crashed into the present. I looked at the mortgage statement again. I was paying for a house I should have inherited for free. And now they wanted me to mortgage it further to save the brother who had never worked a hard day in his life. The fog of duty finally lifted, revealing the ugly truth beneath. This wasn't a family relying on each other. This was a harvest. I was the crop, and they were stripping the field bare. They didn't want my help. They wanted my blood. And for the first time in 46 years, I decided they couldn't have it. I didn't throw my phone against the wall, though every fiber of my being wanted to. Instead, I gently placed it on the counter, took a deep breath, and dialed the one number I knew I could trust. David was my oldest friend, a man who had traded his youthful dreams of being a poet for the lucrative, cynical reality of forensic accounting. He had spent the last 20 years untangling the financial lies of Chicago's divorcees and embezzlers, and I prayed he could untangle mine. An hour later, I was sitting in his office, surrounded by the smell of old coffee and dust, watching him type furiously on his keyboard. I had told him everything: Aunt Anna's outburst, the memory of the papers I signed at 18, and the fresh demand for a cash-out refinance. David didn't look at me with pity. He looked at the screen with the cold, surgical focus of a coroner examining a body. When he finally stopped typing, the silence in the room was heavy enough to choke on. He spun his monitor around. There, digitized in high definition, was a scanned document from the county clerk's archives dated August 14, 1998. It wasn't a financial aid form. At the top, in bold, terrifying letters, it read, "Disclaimer of interest." My eyes scanned the legalese, my stomach twisting into knots. David explained what I was looking at in a voice devoid of emotion, which somehow made it worse. By signing this, I had legally rejected my grandmother's bequest. I had voluntarily stepped aside, allowing the title of the lake house and the jewelry to pass to the next of kin, my parents. I stared at the signature at the bottom of the page. It was mine, shaky, and looped the penmanship of a naive 18-year-old girl who believed her mother was helping her secure a future, not stealing it. They had tricked me into disinheriting myself. I felt a wave of nausea so violent I had to grip the edge of the desk to keep from falling out of the chair. It wasn't just greed. It was a premeditated, calculated betrayal executed against their own child before she had even left the nest. David, however, was already moving past the emotional wreckage to the financial reality. He pulled up a second document, the deed from 5 years ago, when I bought the house from them. He laid it out with brutal clarity. My parents had taken the house I gave them for free, lived in it for decades, and then when they needed cash for their lavish lifestyle, they sold it back to me at market value. I had taken out a mortgage for $1.5 million, to buy property that was rightfully mine to begin with. I was essentially paying a monthly ransom for my own inheritance. I put my head in my hands, the absurdity of it threatening to make me scream. But then David tapped the desk, a sharp rhythmic sound that brought my head up. He pointed to the current market assessment. Because the housing market in the area had exploded, the estate was now valued well over $2 million. Since I had been aggressively paying down the principal for 5 years, the math had shifted. I owed the bank about $500,000, but the house was worth much more. That left nearly $1 million in equity. "That's why they want you to refinance, Sam," David said, leaning back in his chair. "They know the equity is there. That $1 million is sitting in the walls of that house. It's legally yours. If you refinance and give it to Kevin, you're burning your own net worth to keep him warm. But here's the problem: if you just say no, they will make your life a living hell. They'll guilt you, harass you, maybe even sue you for elder abuse or some other nonsense to force a sale. You're the owner, but you're trapped by the relationship." I wiped my face, the tears drying into a mask of cold resolve. I didn't want to just say no. I wanted to end this cycle forever. I asked David if there was a third option, something that wasn't capitulation and wasn't open war. David looked at me, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. He pulled a fresh legal pad from his drawer and wrote 3 words at the top: "Irrevocable Charitable Trust." He began to sketch out a structure that was as brilliant as it was ruthless. He explained that we could move the house into a trust. To my mother and Kevin, we would pitch it as a sophisticated tax shelter, a way to protect the family legacy and gain prestige, things they craved more than air. We would tell them it was the only way to access the money without losing 40% to capital gains taxes. But the devil, David explained, was in the definitions. An irrevocable trust meant that once the asset was moved, it could never be taken back by the grantor, me, or them. And by designating it as a charitable entity, the asset would be legally bound to a philanthropic mission. The house would no longer be a personal piggy bank. It would be a protected entity, legally untouchable by personal creditors, debt collectors, or greedy brothers looking for a bailout. It was a cage disguised as a castle. If I could get them to sign off on this, believing it was their idea, they would be the ones locking the door on their own fortune. I looked at the legal pad, watching the diagram of the trap take shape. The fear that had paralyzed me since the anniversary party began to evaporate, replaced by a strange, icy calm. I realized I didn't need a weapon to fight them. I just needed their own greed. 2 days later, I staged the performance of my life at the Gilded Lily, a French bistro my mother adored because the menu had no prices, and the waiters sneered at anyone wearing polyester. I arrived 10 minutes early, checking my reflection in the spoon to ensure I looked sufficiently beaten down. When Mother and Kevin arrived, they swept in with the air of royalty, claiming their throne, though Kevin's nervous tick, a constant tapping of his fingers against his thigh, betrayed his desperation. I didn't wait for the appetizers to arrive before I started my pitch. I kept my voice low and apologetic, bowing my head slightly as I explained that I had tried to initiate the refinance personally, but my accountant had flagged a massive tax liability. I saw the anger flare in Kevin's eyes, ready to accuse me of stalling, so I quickly pivoted to the bait David and I had crafted. I told them that while I couldn't pull the money out, we could do something far better, something that the truly wealthy did to avoid taxes altogether. I proposed the creation of the Sterling Family Trust. I watched the transformation happen in real time. The moment I said the words tax haven and corporate interest rates, Kevin stopped tapping his leg, but it was the word chairman that hooked my mother. I told her that by moving the lake house into this trust, she would be named the founding chairman, a title that implied power, prestige, and a legacy she could flaunt at her bridge club. I explained that trusts like these were how families like the Rockefellers protected their wealth from the IRS, allowing them to borrow against assets without triggering income tax audits. I laid it on thick, using every buzzword I knew. They worshipped legacy control, exemption, dynasty. I told them that once the house was in the trust could open a line of credit for Kevin's business ventures, at a fraction of the cost of a personal mortgage. By the time the entrees arrived, they weren't just agreeing to the plan, they were looking at me with a rare, smug approval, convinced that I had finally learned how to play the game their way. They had no idea I was rewriting the rules entirely. The signing took place the following afternoon in David's conference room, a space designed to intimidate with its floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves and view of the Chicago skyline. David played his part to perfection, greeting them with the solemn deference of an undertaker. He placed a stack of documents on the table that was nearly 3 inches thick, bound in heavy blue cardstock. The atmosphere was thick with greed. My mother immediately zeroed in on the first page, running her manicured finger over the embossed words, "The Sterling Family Irrevocable Trust." She didn't bother to ask what irrevocable meant in a legal context. She was too busy admiring how her name looked next to the title of chairman. Kevin was vibrating with impatience, flipping to the back to find the signature lines, his eyes glazed over with the anticipation of an $800,000 payday. I sat between them, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought they might hear it. I watched as they breezed past the most critical pages of the document, specifically Section 4.2 titled Asset Permanence and Philanthropic Allocation. If they had taken 10 seconds to read the dense single-spaced text, they would have seen the trap. They would have read that any asset transferred into this trust was immediately designated as a charitable holding, legally bound to specific philanthropic causes, in this case, housing for at-risk youth. They would have seen that the chairman had no power to liquidate assets or encumber them for personal debt. They would have seen that the trust was overseen by an independent third-party administrator, David's firm, whose sole fiduciary duty was to protect the charity, not the family. But they didn't read. To them, the thick paragraphs of legalese were just hurdles to jump over to get to the money. They saw the paper as a formality. I saw it as a steel cage. David handed my mother the heavy Montblanc pen. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, the nib hovering over the signature line. She looked up at me, a flicker of that old predatory instinct surfacing. "Samantha," she said, narrowing her eyes slightly, "and this definitely gets us the money faster. You're sure the bank will accept this structure?" The air in the room seemed to vanish. This was the precipice. If I stuttered, if I showed even a hint of the vindication burning inside me, she would pull back. I forced my face into a mask of helpful submission. "It's the only way to get the money, Mom." I lied, my voice steady and smooth. "The bank loves trusts. It secures everything." The lie was the lubricant she needed. She smiled a triumphant, greedy little smirk and pressed the pen to the paper. The scratching sound of her signature filled the silent room, followed immediately by Kevin's hurried scrawl. They sat back, beaming at each other, already mentally spending the money they believed they had just unlocked. I kept my hands folded in my lap to hide the shaking, watching David notarize the pages with a heavy final thud of his stamp. They stood up, shaking hands and congratulating themselves on their financial savvy, completely oblivious to the reality of what they had just done. They thought they were signing a receipt for their money. They didn't read close enough to see they were signing a donation. The silence that followed the signing lasted exactly 72 hours, a brief, suffocating interlude that I spent preparing for the final act of my play. I knew the timeline perfectly because David had scheduled the activation of the trust's assets to coincide with a specific banking window. On the morning of the third day, my phone erupted on my desk, vibrating with a violence that told me the trap had officially sprung. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I could visualize the scene playing out across town at the First National Bank branch as clearly as if I were standing there. Kevin and my mother would have walked in with the swagger of conquerors, demanding to see the branch manager to access their new $800,000 line of credit. They would have already spent the money in their heads, Kevin on his debts, Mother on her image. But instead of a cashier's check, they would have been met with the confused, terrified expression of a bank officer reading the trust documents I had filed. I later learned from the frantic voicemails that the manager had turned pale as he reviewed Section 4.2. He had to explain to my mother, the newly appointed chairman, that while the Sterling Family Trust did indeed own the property and its equity, the assets were frozen under a strict philanthropic charter. He would have used words like federal fraud, embezzlement, and prison time when they demanded he release the funds for personal use. I imagined the color draining from Kevin's face as the manager explained that using a charitable trust to pay off gambling debts wasn't just against bank policy. It was a felony that would trigger an immediate investigation by the IRS and the state attorney general. The equity, that beautiful $1 million cushion, was sitting right there in the account, untouchable, locked behind a wall of good intentions that I had built brick by brick. When my mother finally stopped screaming at the manager and realized the magnitude of what had happened, she didn't go home. She came for me. I was waiting for her at the grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel. It was the perfect stage for the final confrontation, the launch party for the Sterling Housing Initiative, a charity event I had hastily organized with David's help to cement the trust's public legitimacy. The room was filled with the city's elite reporters from the society pages and local politicians, all there to celebrate the Sterling family's incredible generosity. I stood under a massive banner that read, "Building a Future for Those in Need," holding a glass of sparkling water, accepting congratulations on behalf of my family. The irony was so rich I could taste it. I was being praised for giving away the very thing my family had tried to steal from me. Then the double doors burst open. My mother stormed in looking like a fury wrapped in Chanel. Her hair was slightly disheveled, her eyes wild with a mixture of panic and rage that she was barely suppressing. She spotted me across the room and cut through the crowd like a shark, ignoring the greetings of her friends. She cornered me near the ice sculpture, gripping my arm with bruising force, her nails digging into my skin through the silk of my blouse. "Fix it," she hissed, her voice a low, venomous tremble that only I could hear. "You little witch, you tricked us. Go to the bank right now and sign the release. Kevin is going to be killed if he doesn't get that money. Undo the trust, now." I looked down at her hand on my arm, then up at her face. The fear in her eyes was real, but so was the entitlement. She still believed she could bully me into submission, that I was still the daughter who would set herself on fire to keep them warm. But that daughter had died in a bathroom stall 3 days ago. I didn't pull away. Instead, I raised my voice, pitching it perfectly so that it carried over the soft jazz music and the chatter of the crowd. "Mom," I said, my tone laced with shock and confusion. "I don't understand. You're the chairman. You signed the papers to donate the house to the foundation to help homeless youth. It was your idea." Heads turned. The conversation in the immediate vicinity died instantly. A reporter from the Chicago Tribune stepped closer, his pen hovering over his notepad. My mother froze, her grip on my arm loosening as she realized the audience she had attracted. I didn't stop. I pressed the advantage, making sure the trap closed tight. "Are you saying you want to defraud the charity, Mom? Are you asking me to help you embezzle funds from the foundation to pay for Kevin's gambling debts? Because if that's what you're asking, we need to call the district attorney right now to clarify the legality. I can't be a party to fraud, and I know you wouldn't want to tarnish your legacy like that." The silence in the ballroom was absolute. Every eye was fixed on Margaret Sterling. She stood at the precipice of an impossible choice. On one side was the truth she could scream, that she never intended to be charitable, that she only wanted the money, and that her son was a degenerate gambler who needed a bailout. That path led to social suicide, legal investigations, and the total destruction of the reputation she had spent 50 years cultivating. On the other side was the lie she could accept the role of the saint, the generous benefactor who had given everything to the poor, effectively condemning her son to face his creditors alone and leaving herself penniless but revered. I watched the calculation happen behind her eyes. I saw the exact moment her vanity won the war against her maternal instinct. She looked around at her wealthy friends, at the cameras, at the banner with her name on it. She realized she had been checkmated. She retained the title, but I had blocked the money forever. I signaled a waiter, took a fresh glass of champagne, and pressed it into her trembling hand. "Congratulations on your generosity, Madam Chairman," I whispered. She looked at me with pure hatred, but then she turned to the cameras and smiled. She loved her reputation more than she loved her son. The flashbulbs faded. The gala ended, and the guests went home with their gift bags and their admiration for the selfless Sterling family intact. But the reality that descended on the lake house the next morning was far less glamorous. Without the bailout money, the house of cards Kevin had built collapsed with breathtaking speed. It started with the car. 3 days after the gala, a tow truck rumbled up the long gravel driveway of the estate, now officially the headquarters of the Sterling Housing Initiative, and hooked up Kevin's leased Porsche. He stood on the porch screaming obscenities and waving his arms, but the repo man didn't care about his last name or his mother's new title. He just cared about the 6 missed payments. Kevin watched his status symbol disappear down the road, leaving him stranded in a mansion that was no longer his home, but a legal entity he was merely allowed to occupy as a caretaker. The creditors were less polite than the bank. While I never found out the grim details of how he settled his gambling debts, I know he had to liquidate everything he owned. His watch collection, his designer wardrobe, and even his share of a small tech startup, just to keep his kneecaps intact. He was forced to move back into the main wing with Mother, a 43-year-old man, with no job, no car, and no prospects, trapped with the woman who had enabled his incompetence his entire life. They became prisoners of their own vanity. The trust, strictly governed by the bylaws David and I had written, paid for the property taxes and the structural maintenance of the house because it was a charitable asset, but it didn't pay for their lifestyle. It didn't pay for the country club memberships, the catered dinners, or the heating bill for the massive swimming pool. They were house poor in the most literal sense, living like squatters in a palace, eating canned soup on fine china because they had no liquid cash. I heard from a neighbor that the fights between them were legendary screaming matches that echoed through the empty halls, a toxic cycle of blame where Kevin accused Mother of signing the trust, and Mother accused Kevin of needing the money in the first place. They were miserable, isolated, and completely stuck with each other, guarding a fortress that they could neither sell nor mortgage. As for me, I didn't stick around to watch the walls close in on them. A week after the confrontation, I resigned from my role as the unofficial family manager. I didn't send a letter. I simply stopped showing up. I moved out of my overpriced apartment, which had been too close to them for comfort, and rented a smaller, sun-drenched unit on the north side of the city. For the first time in 20 years, my name wasn't on a deed, a mortgage, or a loan application. I owned nothing on paper, and the lightness of that realization made me giddy. I bought furniture that I liked, not what fit the family aesthetic. I spent my weekends reading books instead of reviewing legal contracts or managing Kevin's crises. I remember the first Sunday morning in my new place, sitting by the window with a cup of coffee that cost $2, watching the rain fall against the glass. My phone rang on the kitchen counter. The screen lit up with Mother. In the past, that ringtone would have triggered a Pavlovian spike of cortisol, a rush of panic that I needed to fix something immediately. But this time, I just looked at it. I watched the name flash and fade until the screen went dark. I didn't block the number. I just chose not to answer. It was a small act, but it felt like breaking a chain. I realized then that I hadn't walked away with the $1.5 million. In a strictly financial sense, I had lost that inheritance. But I had gained something money couldn't buy. I had my dignity back. I met friends for dinner and didn't have to check my phone under the table. I started dating a kind man who had no idea who the Sterlings were and liked me for my laugh, not my usefulness. The audience of my life had shifted. I was no longer performing for a mother who couldn't love me, or a brother who only saw me as an ATM. I had cut the strings, and the silence that followed wasn't lonely. It was symphonic. In the quiet moments, I sometimes think about the nature of family duty versus abuse. For so long, I thought they were the same thing. I thought enduring their exploitation was the price of admission for their love. But I realized that some daughters aren't raised to be loved. They are raised to be useful, to be the safety nets that catch the golden children when they fall. I didn't destroy my family. I didn't ruin them. All I did was remove the crutch they had been using to beat me with. I turned their greed into a cage, locked the door, and walked away. They have the title, the mansion, and the prestige they practically sold their souls for. They have their millions locked away in a glass case they can never touch. I have something worth much more. I have my silence. And it is finally beautifully mine. What a powerful ending to Samantha's journey. She finally found the peace she deserved, but her solution leaves us with a lingering question that I want to put to you. Do you think Samantha went too far by locking away the family fortune forever and leaving her mother and brother trapped in that house without funds? Or was her charitable revenge the perfect justice for years of financial and emotional abuse? I know many of you watching may have faced similar burdens, acting as the reliable rock in a family that takes more than it gives. I would love to hear your perspective in the comments below, as your personal experiences and opinions truly enrich our community discussions. If this story resonated with you and you want to hear more tales of resilience, justice, and the courage to start over, please take a moment to click that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We are building a space here for stories that matter, and we do not want you to miss the next one. Thank you for spending your time with us today, and remember that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away.